We're Brianna and Keely, and you're listening to the Where We Live podcast, where we discuss all things home.
You'll hear from us on residential real estate, the process of buying and selling a home, design trends, entrepreneurship, faith, and much more.
In this episode, we do a deep dive on what is known as an option period here in Texas. An option period is crucially important when buying a home, and we felt it deserved its own episode so that we can explore the ins and outs.
One of the most common fears when buying a home is that a buyer would be committed to a house that would end up being a money pit. In a lot of ways, the option period helps alleviate those fears and creates time for due diligence. If you don't know what an option period is or want more information on how to make it work for you, listen up.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay, we are going to talk today about the all-important option period. Option period can be, we're just going to kind of define it. It can be a very small part of the process, but I would say one of the most crucial. And so we wanted to devote a whole episode to it today. So kind of let's start with the bare bones basic. We want to define the option period for you. So a typical contract period, so from the time you get under contract, everyone agrees and you sign, you're under contract on a house, to when you get the keys, the most common time frame for that here in Texas is 30 days, okay? The first part of that contract period is what's called the option period. So it's a negotiable amount of time, typically 5 to 10 days. We're seeing a little bit more of it being shorter than that, which we'll talk more about here shortly. But it's a negotiable amount of time that's part of the contract during which you have the unrestricted right to terminate. So you can walk away for absolutely any reason during those first 5 to 10 days of the contract period, and that is known as the option period.
So you pay the seller a fee, termed the option fee, for this right, for the right to terminate during the specific amount of time. That amount, the fee that we pay, is also negotiable. I would say most commonly we see anywhere from as low as $100 to $500.
Yes.
Sometimes we see higher than that, depending on the circumstance and how competitive of a house it is and how many chips the buyer's trying to play. So we pay the fee for it, and we get that unrestricted right to terminate.
And if you close on the property, that money gets refunded to you, so that's great. But you basically should view it as a sunk cost, right? That it's a very inexpensive way to get more time to exclusively explore the property. I would put it that way. During the option period, we're going to do all of our inspections typically because we have the right to walk away if there's something that we just can't get past. And so we want to basically use that opportunity to gather more information that we probably couldn't have gathered just initially seeing the house, especially in today's market when we're seeing homes very quickly, putting in offers very quickly. You're not going back to the house 2 times. You only get to see it once. So at the very least, it gives us more time to kind of think about the house, do our due diligence, and get more information.
So as soon as your contract is signed, meaning as soon as that offer is accepted from the seller, that's when your option period starts. The day that the contract is signed is technically day 0. So if you have a 5-day option period, the day it's signed is day 0, the next day is day 1, and your option period will terminate and be done. Terminate maybe isn't the right word because we can get confused. Expire, thank you. Your option period will expire at 5 p.m. on day 5. So let's talk about what do we do during that option period? What's going to happen? Keely, go ahead. Explain to us what are our top priorities.
Yes. So you've likely heard about the inspection. I would say the most dreaded part of real estate is seeing what the inspector has to say about your property. And so the second that we as realtors know that we're under contract, we're trying to get your inspection scheduled ASAP. So as fast as you can, because the earlier you get the general inspection done in the option period, the more time we have to kind of take next steps as needed. So a general inspector, they are also very busy right now, as you would expect, with so many people getting homes under contract. It's typically going to take 2 or 3 days to get them out. They're going to spend about 4 hours at the house. That's all going to depend on what size house you have, if there's a crawl space that they have to crawl all the way under the house. So that's going to vary. Typically going to cost you around $500 to $600. Again, varies on the size of the house and the amount that they need to inspect. But they're going to do their due diligence of the house. Now, when we're walking through looking at homes, homes before we get under contract. Brianna and I have seen a lot of inspections, have seen a lot of houses. We're going to be looking in detail to try to see red flags on the front end before we put any money into doing the option period and paying for an inspection. But this inspector is going to get much more detailed than we can. We're not licensed inspectors, obviously. We're just here to help and try to advocate for you on the front end. But they're going to be the ones crawling in the attic, getting on the roof, getting in the crawl space, running every faucet, flushing every toilet. And we're going to meet them if you can, at the end of the inspection for a debrief. So we're going to let them do their thing. We don't want any mistakes or anything missed during the inspection, but then we want to hear the inspector's report. And tell us a little bit about their report.
Yeah, so the inspector's report, depending on the age of your home, could be a 20-page report. So many of those items are going to be honey-do list items, is what we say, because especially if it's an old home, we can't expect it to be built to today's building codes because codes change all the time. We are only focused on looking for 2 items, which are either really big ticket items, meaning something that would be a very expensive fix for you. We don't want you to move into your house and then have to pay $20,000 or even $5,000 or $10,000.
Yeah, your roof is straight up leaking. Your AC isn't cooling. Great examples of that.
Yep. Or safety hazards. These might be very small prices to fix and to correct, but if it's a safety hazard, we definitely need to know about that and want that fixed and corrected before you are moving into this house. So we are focusing just on big ticket items and safety hazards.
So we're going to get that inspector's report. A lot of times the inspector is going to ask us to get additional specialists out to take a look. So an inspector is a generalist. He is not a specialist, and he is definitely not a contractor of any sort. So he cannot give us estimates on what it might cost to fix most of the things. He can tell us small things like, you can use your screwdriver to tighten that handle, right? But he's not going to tell us how much it's going to cost to replace your HVAC system. And so that's where we're here to help you navigate that. I would say the most common people that we end up getting out are a roofer. If it looks like the roof is in really bad shape and we need to get an estimate of, hey, might insurance be able to cover that? A full roof replacement? Are we looking at just some minor repairs to the roof to get it where it needs to be? And also getting the foundation measured is very, very common. So most foundation companies will come out and measure your foundation for free. Obviously, the hope for most of these contractors is that they quote you for free so that eventually they could do the work for you. And so it's highly important that you get people out during this time that you trust. We have a lot of people that we work with a much higher frequency than normal people, right? Because we're looking at homes every day. And so we have quite a good roster of those kinds of people that we can get out. But most of those aren't going to cost you money, and we are going to be able to get a financial grasp on what these things are going to cost to fix.
I do think it's important to note that for our listeners that are not in Texas, the roof and the foundation are probably pretty specific to Texas. Those are the most common needs here in Texas. But if you live in a different part of the country or a different country, then those are going to be different for you. We just have some specific things here in Texas, and roof and foundation are high frequency needs for us.
Yes, don't be afraid. We get a lot of hail. It's pretty common for hail to hit a house once every 7 years. I had a roofer just tell me. And so for us, it's very uncommon to have to pay for a whole new roof. I know there are a lot of climates where you need to save up to pay for your roof. For us, most of the time, you're going to be able to cite a hailstorm that's done enough damage to your roof that you just pay your deductible and get a new roof. Yeah. For the foundation, we have clay soil, which is highly porous, which means that when we get a lot of rain, it really swells in a big way. And then when we have a lack of rain and a major drought, it shrinks. So that's not the best for your foundation. There's a lot of movement there. And so while HGTV would have you believe that those two things are going to be deal breakers, they really aren't here. And I think most of the time in the option period, it's not a matter of something is not fixable on a house. Right. It's going to be really rare that your house is built on a sinkhole and we can't do anything about it, right? You know, the real question is how much are these things going to cost to fix and who's going to pay for it? And if we can't come to terms on that, that is a reason that you probably would terminate.
That brings us to our next point perfectly, Keely. So what happens if we do find a big ticket item? What if the foundation must be repaired? Or if we find a safety hazard? What are our options?
Yeah, so good question. So we're always going to get a contractor to give us a quote because the seller has much more of an incentive to get it done as cheaply as possible, right? Not to say that sellers are bad people, just to say they have a different investment in this than you do, right? And so we have two options. We can ask the seller to fix it, okay? And there's pros and cons to both of these options. Or we can ask for a financial credit to then be able to fix it on once you close on the house. So it's basically they would give you a credit on your closing costs so that theoretically you would have the cash in hand to be able to do that. So you want to talk about pros and cons of both?
Yeah, I think it really depends on what the issue is. If it's a safety hazard, we just want it fixed, period, right? If it's a foundation issue, if the foundation issue is significant enough, it may have to be done before closing because the lender may have a problem with it, okay? So there are some times that it just has to be fixed before closing. But what Keely mentioned, she said the seller has a different investment in this than you, right? The seller's just trying to get to the closing table. Of course, some sellers care much more because of their nature. But in general, let's assume that they're just trying to get to the closing table. So they're going to take the shortest avenue to the closing table, which likely means the cheapest contractor, which might not be in your best interest. So oftentimes it is in our best interest as the buyer to get a credit so that you can make the work, you can have the work done after you close and it be up to your standards, okay? And so specifically how that works is Keely mentioned a credit towards your closing cost. Closing cost is an out-of-pocket expense for you, so we're reducing that amount, right? So if your closing costs were, these are random numbers, if your closing costs were $7,000 and we reduce that now to $4,000, theoretically, you have $3,000 cash on hand to make these repairs after closing. So oftentimes that's the best case scenario. You're not arguing with the seller, because what if you had them make the repairs and you're not happy with it?
Right.
But they made the repairs, so now the story's done, and now you also don't have the credit and the cash available to go fix it. So
yes, we're going to evaluate it situation by situation.
Yes.
Obviously, there's a lot here because you can also choose your own timing on when you want to fix it. If it's not something that's urgent, you could take your time if you want. But also, sometimes you fix one thing and it leads to another problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there may spiral, right?
Yep.
So pros and cons. Home ownership is always going to be just a ball of pros and cons, I would say. So that's just part of it. What I do want to talk to so we talked about roof and foundation being super common. I would say a thing that is very, very common after the general inspection is that we may have to pay for a plumber to come out and give us a further evaluation. So that's a thing that we recommend people have cash on hand to be able to pay. Plumbers aren't cheap. Their time is super expensive. So maybe look into going into the plumbing profession because you make a lot of money. It can be up to, $65, $80 for 15 minutes. Okay. So it can take a little bit. So we always recommend having a couple $100s on hand to be able to pay a plumber to do some testing on your lines. We said there's a lot of foundation movement here. The pipes are encapsulated in a slab foundation. If you have just a fully cement and rebar foundation, your plumbing is in there. So if your foundation is moving, your plumbing is moving too. And we want to make sure that there aren't any cracks or anything unseen that's causing a major issue. That is one of those things, if it's going to cost you $200 to $500 to run some plumbing tests, I've almost never seen a crack in a pipe cost less than that. Well, I've never seen it. We'll put it that way. Yes. And so it is completely worth the money and the investment up front. Your time, your money spent on inspecting during the option period is really going to be the make or break on whether or not you feel fully informed about your house moving forward.
So say I find an issue or I don't, and I still decide I want to exercise my right to terminate during the option period. Can I really do that? Can I really actually terminate for any reason?
Yeah. So let's kind of talk through some scenarios, but the answer is yes. If you pay the fee, which you have to pay the fee. If you don't have an option period.
That's important.
Pay the fee, and you literally check a box, sign an agreement, and walk away. You don't have to give the reason for it. So some people also use this time just to be able to process more. It's an expensive way to do it, not the best, right? And you're going through the tumultuous time of negotiating an offer. But if there's anything that kind of changes during that option period that this house is not for you, you can walk away. So you're the queen, I feel like, of dealing with some major plumbing issues. So talk to us about kind of how you've resolved those and what that practically has looked like.
Yeah. To what we said earlier, every single situation is unique. Every single situation is different. There's a lot of moving pieces. And so I've sold many old houses, and therefore I've sold many houses that have had plumbing issues of some sort. And so everyone has looked different. A couple of times we've had a plumber complete the work before closing. A leak or 2 or 4 have been found. And a lot of times when you find 4 leaks in cast iron plumbing, that means they're spread throughout the house. When we have a slab foundation, that means that the plumber has to hire excavators who come and they dig by hand with a shovel, tunnel underneath the home, and they charge a pretty penny. They charge hundreds of dollars per foot because they're breaking through rocks, and it's a dirty, messy job. Anyway, so it can get quite expensive. It could cost $10,000 to $20,000. That would be an issue for the buyer because the closing costs would not total as much as the plumbing is. So we couldn't do the scenario we talked through earlier where we give a credit to the buyer so the buyer has cash on hand to do it later. Now, if the buyer happens to have plenty of cash on hand, sure, we could reduce the purchase price, right? Reduce the loan amount if they just have the cash on hand and would still rather do it themselves. But if they don't, there is no solution in which we can give them enough cash on hand in the form of a credit, because the dollar amount is too high. So the work's got to be done ahead of time, and the seller pays for it. Another one recently we just did in Richardson, the dollar amount was it was a $10,000 repair. That was still more than the amount of the buyer's credit, but we were able to work out a deal where we used all of the buyer's credit amount. So they basically didn't have to bring money for closing costs. And then the addition above that, which was like $3,000, we took off of the purchase price. And the buyer was great and happy with that, and they were able to do the work after closing.
Yeah.
So it's still different every time. But yes, it's a thing. It happens.
It's absolutely different every time. And here's what I will say to you. We're not trying to scare you. I do think the option period and the inspection is likely the scariest part for most people. But doing your inspections, doing your due diligence is absolutely worth your time. And we're just going to take it one step at a time. If the inspector says get a plumber out here, let's see what they have to say. And then we'll take it from there and see how the sellers are going to negotiate. You have the comfort in the option period of knowing that you have the right to walk away. And all you would leave on the table is your option fee. And then obviously you've paid your inspector already. That is going to be much cheaper than buying a house that has a bunch of problems, okay? So just be aware that it is very much a tool that can be used for you. We are experts at navigating the option period, trying to make sure that we really maximize the amount of time that we have to get all the information that we're looking for. Mm-hmm. And so we mentioned that the option fee, the option period are negotiable as part of your offer. It used to be that 7 to 10 day option periods were way more normal, right? Mm-hmm. In a market that wasn't as competitive. But for a seller, that's very scary sitting on the other side, knowing that your buyer can just walk away for any reason. And then the next buyer believes that there's something that was bad enough that they had to walk away. So typically you're going to get less for your house the second time around, okay? So people are getting really aggressive with the length of the option period. The shorter that it is, the more appealing that it is to a seller. So we're seeing more and more common 3 or 5 day option periods. I would say 7 feels like a luxury vacation to us at this point. And so just be aware your agent is going to talk you through how to use that as a negotiating chip. We don't recommend going without an option period for all of the reasons we just talked about, because we really want you to know more about your house.
The option period is one of the most important parts of the contract period, so we hope you learned something today. The better prepared you are for buying a home, the less overwhelming the process will be.
If you're wondering if you're ready to buy a house, You can do this. Go back and listen to episode 7 titled, Am I Ready to Buy a House? We also have a quiz on wherewelivepodcast.com that lets you know if you're ready to buy.
That wraps up another episode of the Where We Live podcast. We want to hear which topics interest you most for our upcoming shows.
Head on over to wherewelivepodcast.com to continue the conversation in our Facebook group, read our blog, and connect with us. Thanks for tuning in.